So this is 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 1. We're picking up a little bit from last night. When the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, the Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha said, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. And a company of prophets at Bethel came out to Elisha and asked, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "I know," Elisha replied. "Be quiet." Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, Elisha. The Lord has sent me to Jericho." But Elisha replied, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went to Jericho. And another company of prophets there at Jericho, they went up to Elisha and asked him, "Do you know that the Lord's going to take your master from you today?" "I know," Elisha replied. "Be quiet." And then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." And Elisha said again, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So the two of them walked on. 50 men from the company of the prophets went and stood at a distance. They were facing the place where Elijah and Elisha had stopped at the Jordan. And Elijah took his cloak, he rolled it up, he struck the water with it, and the water divided to the right and to the left. And the two of them crossed over on dry ground. And when they had crossed over, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" And Elisha replied, "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." "Oh, you have asked a difficult thing," Elijah said. "Yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours, that double portion. Otherwise, it will not." Man, Elisha's a little eager beaver, isn't he? Man, he is ready. He is here for all the things. He's like, let's go. You can barely hold the guy back. Did you see that in the text? I mean, 3 different times. He's just following Elijah around everywhere he goes. And 3 different times, Elijah says, "You can stay here if you want to." And Elisha 3 different times says, "Nope, I'm all in. I'm following you wherever you go." 2 times, a group of prophets come up to Elisha and they say, "Do you realize what you're getting yourself into? Sometime soon, your master's going to be taken from you. You're going to be on your own." And every time Elisha says, "I know that he's going away. Just shut up and go away yourselves." And then at that moment, after they've crossed over the waters, Elijah turns to Elisha and says, "Is there anything that you need?" And Elisha's response is, "Yes, give me the double portion." Now that might sound a little strange to you, but you got to understand how giddy Elisha is to get going in his task. Because that language that's used is Old Testament language. It was used in terms of an inheritance. It's how you would talk if you were a son to your father and you would turn to him near the end of his life and say, I'm ready, Dad, to carry on your legacy. I'm ready to carry on the family business. Give me the double portion that goes to the firstborn who's been set aside to do that kind of work." And then still, when Elijah turns to Elisha and says, "You have no idea what you're asking for," Elisha still stands there blinking and smiling and says, "Bring it." And what a little eager beaver Elisha is. He is, as I'd put it this way, he is the epitome of the "here am I" guy. I don't know how much of the Old Testament you've read, but there's moments throughout the history of Old Testament where we've got men and women who sense a calling from God. They sense a calling of God to step into the story that he's writing. And some of these men and some of these women, man, they just run right up and they say, "Well, here am I. Where do you want me to go? I'm going. Let's go. I'm here for all the things." Man, that's Elisha. Elisha is the epitome of the "here am I" guy. And when I think about Elisha the prophet being that way, I find myself thinking, man, we've come a long way to that prophet, Elisha, all the way from the very first prophet we read about in the Bible. You know who the first prophet is? It's Moses. It's Moses. Man, it is hard. When you read, listen, this is one of the things that happened for me in preparing for this week with you all. It is impossible to read the story of Elijah and to read the story of Elisha and not find yourself constantly thinking about Moses. There's way too many tie-ins, and maybe some of you have picked up on them. I pointed out a couple along the way, but think about the parallels here. They all have to stand up against world powers that seek to crush Israel. I mean, you think about some of the amazing cosmic battles that have happened here where the heavens have opened up and does amazing things. Think about the moment when Elijah is traveling through the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. It's not 40 years, is it? But isn't that what it was like for Moses and Israel in the desert? I have already pointed out to you Mount Horeb. The place where Moses stood, that's the place where Elijah stood. Now we've parted waters. Does that sound familiar? That's the stuff of Moses. But back to Mount Horeb, that's what has me thinking here about what it was like for the first prophet long before Elisha. Because Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, is not just the place where Moses gets the 10 Commandments. Mount Horeb was where Moses got his calling to be a prophet. You know a bit of that story. He's going through the wilderness. He sees a bush that is burning, and yet it is not burnt up. And he draws closer to it. He actually says, well, this is a little weird. Let's take a look. And as he draws closer, God calls to him from within the bush. This is Exodus chapter 3. And God simply says, Moses, Moses. And it starts out pretty good because Moses answered, here am I. But then God went a step further. And the Lord said to Moses, okay, well, I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. I'm concerned about their suffering, so I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And that here am I from Moses becomes this. Right after that in verse 11. But Moses said to God, what? Who am I? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Who am I, God? And if you read this moment in which God is calling Moses to step in the story, where God is calling forth the first of many prophets that will lead all the way to Elisha, in that moment, Moses keeps pushing back against God. No, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? He gives all kinds of excuses. I don't have the kind of authority. I don't have the kind of reputation behind my name. I can't perform signs and wonders. In fact, you're wanting me to go to talk to all of these people, not just Egypt, but Israel too. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm a terrible speaker, Moses says. The Hebrew language that's used there, he says, I've got a fat tongue. I've got a heavy tongue. Like I can't talk. When I try to, the words get mumbled up. And what Moses pushes back says, who am I? Have you considered someone else? Have you considered my brother Aaron? Have you considered some other guy? Have you considered some other gal? Because who am I to be sent by you? Who am I? And he's crushed in his fear and trembling, the very first prophet. Listen, I'm more of a who am I guy. You? I'm more of a who am I guy. Whenever I have sensed the kinds of moments that all of us sensed in each our way last night, this moment in which we're being called to step into the story, this moment in which we recognize a sentness that is being stirred among us, we are being called to go. Whenever that has happened in my life, I have always thrown up my hands in deeply embedded fear and said, but who am I? Guys, it's nuts for me to be back at CIY because I can remember at CIY, it was at Milligan College in Tennessee when I was your age. And I remember the first night at the end of the night session, I felt this stirring deep within me that I was supposed to go into ministry. And you know what my response was? And that's not just me saying no, that's me trying not to puke. Like I did not want to do this. But the second night at the end of the session, I felt the same thing. I feel like I'm supposed to go into ministry. And I was like, And I started then at that saying to myself, well, God, who am I? Like, have you considered the person standing next to me tonight? But the third night, I felt it again, and I said, And then the fourth night, I felt it again, and I thought to myself, if I don't respond to this, I am disobedient. And I went forward with deep fear and trembling. I was terrified. And I go on to Bible college, and I go to Lincoln Christian College, that was what it was called at the time, and I went there and I studied preaching, and then I went into ministry, and I had to confess to you all that for like the first 5-6 years of ministry, my ministry did not thrive, and I wasn't a great person to be around because I was crushed by my fear, my anxiety over my inadequacy. I was constantly, for the first 5-6 years of ministry, saying, who am I? Who am I? I should just call it all off. Have you considered bringing someone else in to just relieve me? And I felt the same kind of thing when I sensed a calling to go into church planting. Who am I? I felt the same thing when it came to going back to Lincoln Christian University to serve. And I thought to myself, who am I to go back and minister among these men and women who taught me and instructed me and discipled me? Man, guys, when they called me to speak here at CIY, would you be interested in speaking at CIY? I didn't want to do it. Who am I? You? Man, how many times in your life have you sensed a calling from God for you to step into the story? Maybe even last night. Now, last night, we're all fired up. There's this beautiful, wonderful message from Drew, and it gets us thinking, man, we are sent, and we have to carry this forward. And last night, we're writing names, and we're writing certain contexts and circumstances that we want to step into. But how many here woke up this morning and you thought to yourself, what did I do last night? And you walk in and you see the titles and the names and the circumstances that you listed, and you think, oh my goodness, I'm just going to pretend I didn't do that because it's the last day and I've got to go back to these people. I've got to go back to these circumstances. And who am I? Man, I don't know if you're at all like me, but a Moses guy, a who am I guy, that's me. That's my lane. That's my speed. Elisha, the here am I guy, But what is it that made Elisha a here am I guy? What is it that made him this little eager beaver to say, man, I will follow you to the ends of the earth. Give me the double portion. What was it that made him a here am I guy? What made him a here am I guy is that this prophet, after a long line of prophets, knows the rest of the story of what happened with that first prophet. He knows what happened with Moses in the moment of his calling. Elisha knows that in the midst of Moses pushing back against God, that God thunderously puts Moses in his place. And there's Moses in Exodus chapter 3, and he's saying, who am I? Who am I? I can't do signs and wonders. I'm poor of speech. I'm the least eloquent person you could possibly send out there. Who am I? Who am I? And finally, in the midst of it, God thunderously says, who am I, Moses? Who am I? You're asking this question about who you are. Who am I? And God doesn't wait for him to answer. He says, Moses, I will tell you what my name is. My name, and it will be known as my name for generations to come, for now and forevermore. My name is I am. I always have been, I am, I always will be. I am the I am. Nothing has been in existence without me. Kingdoms rise and fall without me. Wonders fill the sky and fall from the sky because of me, because I am. So the question you ask when I call you into the story and I call you to be a prophet within this culture, within this time, is not for you to ask who you are, it's to once again ask who I am. And it says, where did you get the idea that really ultimately you're the one who's got to do this anyway? Because if you all read carefully in Exodus chapter 3, before God says, I'm sending you to Egypt, remember what he said? God said, I myself have heard the cries of the people, so I have come down to rescue them. Moses, you do this because the I am is in you and with you, not because of what you're able to do or not able to do. Do you have weaknesses, Moses? Of course you do. And I'm not going to do a thing about it. That's a powerful thing in Exodus 3. When Moses says, I am a terrible speaker, did you realize that God never actually said, oh no, you're great, Moses? He never says it. Somewhere deep within God, God's probably saying, you're a pretty bad preacher. Because he actually comes along and says, I'll send Aaron with you. I'll tell you what to say. You tell Aaron what to say, and he'll say it. There, problem solved. And God could have touched his tongue and made him the most eloquent preacher the world has ever known, but he doesn't. And God could have done it. He turns Moses' rod into a snake. He changes his hand leprous and back again. Goodness gracious, think about all the plagues he's going to do. He doesn't touch the tongue of Moses. And the reason why is because he's saying, I want the people of both Egypt and Israel to see the I am. That when all is said and done, Egypt's back will be broken by a guy who had to tell another guy what to say. Because then when all was said and done, both the people of Egypt and Israel will say, that must have been God. Moses cries out, who am I? And God says, no, who am I? And the reason why Elisha says, here am I, is because he knows the I am. And he knows that when he goes, because he's been sent, the I am goes before him. The I am goes with him. The I am is in him. And so here am I. Man, this is all seen in the request that Elisha makes. Elijah says, what do you need from me before I go? He doesn't just say, give me the double portion in that inheritance language. Remember what he says in full. He says, give me the double portion of your spirit. And when Elisha asks that of Elijah, he is not asking to have the spirit of Elijah in the sense of, I want to walk like you and talk like you and be like you. No, what Elisha is crying out for is for the Spirit of God to rest upon him. For the I am to find its dwelling within him. Because he knows it's the only way he can do it. Because he doesn't just know the stories of Moses, but he knows the story of all of the men and women that the Spirit of God has rested on in those Old Testament times. What the Spirit of God was able to do through Abraham, through Moses, through Joseph before Moses, through David, through the kings, through the prophets. And the reason he can say, here am I, is he's like, I don't have time and patience to go through the who am I. I already know that who I need is the I am, and I'm crying out for it. And it is poured out on him, and on he goes, as you'll talk about a little bit later today. And you are sent. You know this from last night, and you were fired up. You know that you're sent. You had these moments where clearly you heard another whisper from God, and this whisper brought with itself a name, or it brought with itself a circumstance, a context, and you recognize this so clearly last night. And in the courage of this moment, with your brothers and sisters around you, you wrote it down, and you pledged allegiance to this calling, this sentness within your life. But maybe you woke up this morning with fear and trembling, and you think to yourself, what have I gotten myself into? And you ask, who am I? You are the ones who carry the I am. Guys, the Spirit of God rests upon you. Listen, you hold the double portion of this Spirit that's been passed on. In fact, in the Old Testament, it used to only be poured out on certain men and certain women. And yet there was a promise that came through another prophet by the name of Joel. And Joel said in chapter 2, there was a moment where God gave him this decree to say to the people that one day, God says, I will pour out my Spirit on everyone. I will pour out my Spirit on men, on women, on the young and the old. And your men and your women and the girls and the boys, they will dream dreams and they will have visions. And great signs and wonders will be done through them. And they will speak with such authority that kingdoms will collapse. And in Acts chapter 2, this comes true, doesn't it? Man, read Acts chapter 2. It's the birth of the church. And the Spirit of God pours out on all the people who have gathered. And Peter stands up and he clears his throat and he says, this is exactly what Joel said was going to happen. The Spirit has been poured out on common folk here, on fishermen and people who work the marketplace and education folks and politicians and just folks who are just trying to make ends meet. But the Spirit is being poured out on each and every one of you. You will have dreams and you will have visions and you will speak with such authority that kingdoms fall. And you have this. And don't you forget it. It rests on you. It rests within you. You go with the I am. We're called and we're sent to step into the story. The wrong question is, who am I? The right question is, who is he? And the answer to that question is, he's the I am. And the only response you and I can have to that is, here am I. And the only right response that we can have to that is for us to go and to step into the story. Not just that our own stories might be rewritten, but we go and step into the story that other stories of folks that we love might be rewritten. That then they might go and step into the story, that the stories of others in their life might be rewritten, that they might then go, because they've been changed by the story, and step into the stories of other lives, those stories might be rewritten. Because even today, these are the days of Moses and Elijah and Elisha. Because through the gift of what God has done through his Son, the Spirit has been poured out on each and every one of you who cry out. Would you stand, and I want to say a simple prayer.